What would you do if the world saw only your skin and age, ignoring the hero within? On a chilling evening in a quiet neighborhood, 74-year-old Marcus Freeman, a black man with weathered hands and a heart full of untold stories, faced this harsh reality. "Hey, old man, the retirement home's that way," barked a police officer, his words slicing through the air as laughter erupted among the tactical team. Marcus stood frozen, his deep brown eyes reflecting decades of resilience, watching a SWAT team prepare to storm a building where a gunman held 4 hostages. The yellow tape fluttered in the wind, a barrier between him and the home he'd known for 45 years. Can you feel the sting of being dismissed, your voice unheard, your worth unseen? Imagine you're Marcus, standing there, your wisdom ignored. The SWAT team is moments away from a deadly mistake. Would you stay silent, hoping they'll figure it out, or risk everything to speak up, knowing they might not listen? We're the Daily Narrated Stories channel, bringing you gripping tales of justice and humanity. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers. Please hit that subscribe button now to help us reach our goal and never miss a story that could change how you see the world. Marcus Freeman, 74, stood like a statue before the yellow tape that cordoned off the aging residential building, its brick facade weathered by decades of neglect. His calloused hands, etched with the scars of a life hard-lived, gripped the brim of his faded cap, a relic from his last mission in '82, the fabric frayed but holding memories of a time when his voice carried weight. The SWAT team buzzed with frenetic energy around him. Radios crackled with clipped commands. Rifles clicked as magazines were loaded, and vests snapped into place with a rhythmic urgency. They were preparing to breach the apartment where a gunman held 4 souls captive, their lives hanging on the edge of a razor. Marcus's gaze, sharp despite the years that had dulled his body, traced their movements with a precision honed by decades of survival. He saw flaws in their formation, gaps in their cover, an overconfidence in their approach, a disaster waiting to unfold like a storm on the horizon. The air was thick with the metallic tang of gun oil and the faint hum of tension, a sensory assault that stirred memories of battlefields long past. In his mind's eye, he saw the flicker of a jungle night, the muzzle flash of enemy fire, and the faces of men who never made it home, memories that tightened his chest with a mix of dread and determination. "Sir, you need to move back. This area is off-limits," snapped a young officer, named Officer Daniels, his tone dripping with impatience as he strode toward Marcus, his boots crunching on the gravel-strewn pavement. Daniels' face was a mask of youthful arrogance, his blue eyes glinting with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been truly tested. Marcus pointed a steady finger toward an apartment on the 3rd floor, its window dark but familiar, a place where he'd brewed countless cups of coffee and watched the sun rise over the city for 45 years. "That's my home," he said, his voice low and even, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen more than most could imagine. Daniel smirked, glancing at his colleagues who were adjusting their gear nearby. "Right, and I'm Captain America," he sneered, his words sharp as a blade, drawing chuckles from the others who formed a loose semicircle around the building's entrance. "Get out of here before I drag you out." Marcus adjusted his cap, the gesture a quiet act of defiance, and stepped back, the sting of dismissal a familiar ache that burned in his chest like a coal. He'd seen how the officers nodded respectfully to the white residents, Mrs. Harper with her pearl necklace, Mr. Thompson in his press suit, taking their words as gospel, their concerns met with assurances and quick action. But Marcus? His words were met with scorn, his presence an inconvenience, his skin and age rendering him invisible in their eyes. The air smelled of gunpowder and prejudice, a bitter mix that churned his stomach and made his hands tremble. Not with fear, but with the quiet rage of a man who'd spent a lifetime fighting to be seen. Across the street, Commander Evans, a stern man in a pressed suit, barked orders into his phone, his voice a low growl as building blueprints splayed across a police car's hood fluttered in the evening breeze. The standoff had dragged on for 4 hours with no breakthrough, each minute stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. Last contact attempt failed. Suspects not responding. crackled a voice over the radio, the words heavy with the weight of failure. "Bravo team, ready to breach in 90 seconds. Marcus shook his head, his lips tightening into a thin line. He saw what they couldn't. The angle of entry was a death trap, the lack of cover a fatal oversight that would leave the team exposed to a hail of bullets or worse. His mind raced back to a moonless night in '82, a covert op in a war-torn city where he'd led his Delta Force team through a labyrinth of alleys, the air thick with the scent of burning rubber and the screams of the wounded. A similar mistake had cost lives then. A young soldier named Harris, barely 22, his laughter silenced by a sniper's bullet because Marcus hadn't double-checked their approach. The memory brought a sharp pang to his chest, a mix of fear and regret that made his breath catch. He couldn't let history repeat itself. Not here, not now, not in the place he called home. 6 weeks ago, Marcus had noticed a shadowy figure slipping into the building at odd hours, his movements too deliberate to be innocent. The man moved like a predator, his steps silent, his eyes darting with the vigilance of someone who knew he was being watched. Marcus had reported it to the building's security, a portly man named Greg who always smelled of cheap cologne and apathy. "I'll look into it," Greg had said with a lazy wave of his hand, his tone as dismissive as the officer's laughter now. It never happened. Then 2 weeks back, a faint chemical odor wafted from apartment 503, a scent Marcus knew too well from his days defusing IEDs in the field, a mix of ammonia and something sharper, more sinister. It was the smell of danger, of intent, of a plan taking shape in the shadows. He'd alerted Greg again, his voice urgent, his hands gesturing to the ceiling as if he could make the man feel the weight of what he knew. Again, his warnings were ignored, Greg's eyes glazing over with disinterest as he muttered, "Probably just cleaning supplies," before turning back to his phone. Now, as the SWAT team's countdown echoed through the night, team ready to breach in 60 seconds, Marcus felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him like a physical force. This was no longer a standoff. It was a ticking bomb, each second a heartbeat closer to catastrophe. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles whitening as he fought the urge to shout, to make them see what he saw, to stop the tragedy he knew was coming. That was Marcus's breaking point. With a resolve that belied his age, he ducked under the tape, his steps quick and sure, surprising the officers around him who had dismissed him as frail and irrelevant. The yellow tape snapped against his chest, a fleeting resistance that mirrored the barriers he'd faced his whole life. "Hey, stop right there," Officer Daniel shouted, sprinting toward him, his boots pounding the pavement with a rhythm that matched the pounding of Marcus's heart. Two officers grabbed Marcus's arms, their grips bruising, their fingers digging into the thin fabric of his jacket. "What do you think you're doing, old man?" Commander Evans stormed over, his face a mask of irritation, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Marcus standing defiantly in the restricted zone. "Get him out of here," he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap that echoed off the building's walls. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, steady as a drumbeat, each word deliberate and heavy with the weight of truth. "You'll all die if you go in there like that." The words hung in the air, a warning wrapped in the calm of a man who'd faced death too many times to fear it now. Evans scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer that made Marcus's stomach twist with a mix of anger and pity. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's gaze didn't waver, his brown eyes locking onto Evans's with an intensity that made the commander flinch despite himself. "I've known this building for 45 years. I helped build it. There's a hidden passage between apartments 503 and 505. It's not on your blueprints." He set a trap. Evans's expression soured, his sneer deepening as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Oh, we got a master strategist here," he mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he signaled for the officers to remove Marcus. But Marcus's next words stopped them cold, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd been underestimated too long, each syllable a quiet rebellion against the dismissal he'd endured. "You should listen before judging by looks," he said, the words a plea and a challenge all at once. He could feel the eyes of the younger officers on him. their laughter replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the facade of their certainty. "I saw the suspect with chemicals 3 weeks ago. I tried to warn you," Marcus continued, his voice steady but laced with a quiet frustration that made his throat tighten. He remembered the late-night sighting, the man's silhouette against the streetlight, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the faint clink of glass bottles as he disappeared into the building. Marcus had stood at his window, his breath fogging the glass, his heart pounding with the instinct that had kept him alive through countless missions. Evans crossed his arms tighter, his posture defensive. "And why should we trust you?" That's when Marcus spoke 5 words that turned the air to ice. "Delta Force Leader, Operation Vortex." The silence was deafening, a void that swallowed the chatter of the radios, the rustle of tactical gear, the murmur of the crowd across the street. Evans's sneer vanished, replaced by a flicker of recognition, then shock, his eyes widening as the weight of those words settled over him like a shroud. Marcus's mind flashed to 1982, the jungles of a classified location where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and gunpowder. He was 31, leading a Delta Force team through a hail of gunfire, his voice steady as he called out coordinates over the roar of chaos. "Move! Move! Move!" He'd shouted, his breath ragged, his eyes scanning for threats as his team flanked a crumbling warehouse. A young soldier, Private Ellis, had hesitated, his face pale with fear, and Marcus had grabbed his arm, pulling him behind cover just as a grenade exploded where he'd stood. The memory of that night, the screams of his men, the acrid scent of burning foliage, the weight of lives in his hands, flooded back, grounding him in the present. He could still feel the heat of that explosion on his face, still hear Ellis's shaky, "Thank you, sir," a gratitude that had fueled Marcus's resolve to never let another man down. Now, standing in the shadow of his own building, he felt that same resolve burning in his chest, a fire that no amount of prejudice could extinguish. Behind this unassuming elderly black man was a past that would rewrite the night's outcome, a vault of history locked away behind the lines of his weathered face. Those 5 words weren't just a statement. They were a key, unlocking a legacy that few could fathom. Evans blinked, his confidence wavering, his hands twitching at his sides, as if unsure whether to reach for his radio or retreat. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice trembled, a crack in the armor of his authority. Marcus's response was calm, precise, each word a bullet of truth. "Zone 9, code 328 Bravo Delta. Verify it." Evans stepped back, his movements jerky as he muttered into his radio, his eyes darting between Marcus and the building. Moments later, his face paled, the color draining from his cheeks as if he'd seen a ghost. "Sir," he said, his tone shifting to one of respect, the word heavy with an apology he couldn't yet voice. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in the air, their hands hovering over their weapons, as if unsure whether to salute or stand down. Marcus remained stoic, his face a mask of calm, but inside his heart pounded with a mix of vindication and sorrow. "You've got 15 minutes before he triggers the explosives," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within him. "And no, it's not just chemicals. I saw wiring and components being brought in for weeks." Evans ordered his team to fall back, carving out a space for Marcus to speak, the officers forming a loose semicircle around him, as if he were a general addressing his troops. A young female officer, Lieutenant Elena Torres, approached with a notepad, her eyes sharp with curiosity and a flicker of admiration that Marcus hadn't seen in years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform crisp despite the chaos of the night, and her voice carried a sincerity that stood in stark contrast to the contempt he'd faced. "Lieutenant Torres, negotiations specialist. If you know this building, we need your help," she said, her tone free of the condescension that had marked Danielle's words. Marcus nodded, seeing in her a glimmer of genuine respect, a rare light in the darkness of the night. "Apartment 503 has a flaw," he began, his voice steady as he traced the memory of the building's construction in his mind. "During construction, A blueprint error left a crawl space between 503 and 505, accessible through the laundry room vent in 505. It's not on any plans. He could still picture the day they'd poured the concrete for that floor, the summer heat making the air shimmer, the architect's frantic shouts when they'd realized the mistake, but no one had bothered to update the plans, an oversight that now held lives in the balance. Officer Daniels, who'd mocked him earlier, snorted, his face twisting with disbelief as he stepped closer, his shadow falling over Marcus like a storm cloud. So we're trusting some old guy who claims he was a soldier? This is absurd, he muttered, his voice loud enough for the others to hear, his hands gesturing wildly as if to dismiss Marcus's words with the sheer force of his disdain. Evans's voice was low but firm, cutting through Daniels' tirade like a knife. Daniels, I just got confirmation from HQ. This man was one of Delta Force's most decorated leaders. Operation Vortex, 1982, top secret. Daniels' resentment flared, his pride wounded like a beast cornered and lashing out. A black man, an elderly man they'd ridiculed, now held the reins, and the realization burned in his chest like acid. Maybe he was something back then, but that was decades ago. Tactics have evolved, he grumbled, his voice a low growl as he crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing with a mix of defiance and shame. Marcus ignored him, focusing on Torres, his hand steady as he pointed to the blueprint on her notepad, his finger tracing the invisible line of the crawlspace. He'll have rigged the main entrances, he said, his voice calm but urgent. You go in blind, you're walking into a kill zone. Daniels' voice cut through again, sharp and accusing. He could be lying about the explosives, he pressed, his tone laced with desperation as he clung to his skepticism like a lifeline. Marcus shook his head, his movements deliberate as he took an analyst's tablet from a nearby officer, his fingers surprisingly deft for a man of his age. He zoomed in on a grainy image of 503's window, the glass reflecting the faint glow of a streetlight. A small device sat on the sill, wires glinting faintly like the threads of a spider's web. Motion sensor tied to a detonator, Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he knew. This man's trained, military-grade setup. The image was a stark reminder of a mission in 85, a dusty compound where he disarmed a similar device. The countdown ticking in his ears as sweat dripped into his eyes, his hands steady despite the fear that gripped him. Torres's eyes widened as she studied the image, her breath catching in her throat. He's right. How did we miss this? She whispered, her voice a mix of awe and frustration as she turned to Evans, her hands gesturing to the tablet. As the team adjusted their strategy, Marcus sat on a nearby curb, his knee throbbing, a lingering scar from a shrapnel wound in 84, an invisible badge of honor that ached with every change in the weather. The pain was a constant reminder of a mission gone wrong, a grenade that had exploded too close, the screams of his team echoing in his ears as he dragged a wounded soldier to safety. He rubbed his knee absently, his eyes distant as he watched the team reposition, their movements more cautious now, their voices quieter. Torres sat beside him, her notepad resting on her lap, her voice soft with a sincerity that made Marcus's chest ache with a longing for the respect he'd once known. "Why didn't you mention your past before?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for answers. Marcus's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile, the lines on his face deepening with the weight of his years. "Would you believe an old black man claiming he led Delta Force?" he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of a lifetime of dismissal, each word a quiet indictment of the world that had refused to see him. The radio crackled, interrupting their conversation with a jolt of urgency that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. Suspects demanding to speak to someone named Freeman. Says he knows Marcus Freeman. He'll only negotiate with him. All eyes turned to Marcus, the weight of their gazes pressing down on him like a physical force. "Do you know him?" Evans asked, his voice tight with a mix of hope and fear. Marcus's face remained unreadable, his expression a mask of calm that belied the storm of memories raging within him. "James Carter, former Special Forces. We served together decades ago," he said, his voice steady but laced with a sorrow that made his throat tighten. Torres studied him, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of understanding. "You knew he'd asked for you, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. For months, Marcus had watched Carter's movements, late-night deliveries, the faint hum of electronics, the chemical scent that lingered in the hallway like a ghost. Each sign was a piece of a puzzle only someone with his training could assemble, a puzzle that painted a picture of a man on the edge, a soldier broken by the system that had once called him a hero. Marcus's heart pounded as he recalled Carter's laugh during a training exercise in '87. The young soldier's promise to make you proud, Commander, echoing in his ears like a haunting melody. They'd been in a dusty field, the sun beating down on them as Carter nailed every drill, his grin wide and infectious, his eyes bright with the promise of a future Marcus had believed in. Now, that same man was a broken shell, and Marcus felt a pang of guilt that twisted in his gut like a knife. Had he failed Carter by not seeing his descent sooner, by not reaching out when he'd first noticed the signs? The weight of that failure pressed down on him, a burden heavier than the years on his shoulders, and he swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears as he pushed the memory aside. "Let me speak to him," Marcus said, standing with a determination that silenced the team, his voice a quiet command that brooked no argument. In his jacket pocket, a folded note held 5 different words, ones he hadn't yet spoken, waiting for the right moment to shift the tide again, their meaning a secret that could change everything. Marcus donned a bulletproof vest, his hands steady despite the ache in his joints, the fabric heavy against his chest like the weight of the lives he was about to fight for. The vest smelled of nylon and sweat, a familiar scent that brought back memories of missions where every second was a gamble, every breath a victory. Protocol demanded he stay behind the barricade, a safe distance where he could relay information without risk, but he knew Carter wouldn't respond to standard tactics. "I'm going in," he said, removing his earpiece with a deliberate motion, the small device dangling from his fingers like a discarded lifeline. "No way," Evans protested, his voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration as he stepped forward, his hands outstretched as if to physically stop Marcus. "It's against every rule." Marcus's gaze was steel, his eyes locking onto Evans's with an intensity that made the commander take a step back. "Your rules don't work with James Carter. I trained him to resist them," he said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of a man who'd written those rules in blood and sweat. The team fell silent, the air thick with the weight of Marcus's words, their breaths visible in the cool night air as they watched him with a mix of awe and disbelief. Torres nodded, realization dawning in her eyes, her hands tightening around her notepad as she pieced together the puzzle of Marcus's past. "You were his mentor," she said, her voice a whisper of understanding that made Marcus's chest ache with the weight of that truth. Marcus gave a slight nod, his eyes distant as he remembered the long nights of training, the drills he'd run Carter through, the pride he'd felt watching the young soldier grow into a man of skill and courage. Operation Nightshade, 1987. I led a unit for covert ops. Carter was my best. Until Cairo, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of that failure. Torres checked her tablet, her fingers flying over the screen as she searched for records that didn't exist. "There's no record of Cairo in '87, she said, her brow furrowing with confusion. Marcus's eyes grew distant, the screams of that night echoing in his mind. The explosion that had rocked their safe house, the blood on his hands as he tried to save a dying soldier, the official report that had erased it all. Some missions never existed, he replied, his voice a whisper of sorrow that carried the weight of a lifetime of secrets. Daniel scoffed, his voice sharp with disbelief as he stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We're not letting him in based on unverified stories," he said, his tone laced with a desperation that made his voice crack. Evans cut him off, his voice firm, his eyes narrowing with a resolve that brooked no argument. "His identity's confirmed. If he knows Carter, I trust him," he said, his words a quiet command that silenced Danielle's protests. Marcus checked the non-standard pistol Evans had retrieved from the armory, a weapon fit for a man of his caliber, its weight familiar in his hands, the cold metal a reminder of the stakes he was about to face. "I've got 12 minutes, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within him, his eyes locking onto the building as if he could see through its walls to the danger within. "If I'm not out with the hostages by then, do what you must." He approached the building, his steps deliberate, the officers watching in stunned silence, their breaths held as if they could feel the weight of the moment. "He's walking to his death," Daniels muttered, peering through binoculars, his voice a mix of disdain and fear as he watched Marcus's figure disappear into the shadows. Torres shook her head, her voice soft but firm as she turned to Daniels, her eyes blazing with a quiet conviction. "No, he's speaking Carter's language, something we can't." Marcus entered the lobby, his posture upright, his steps steady despite the ache in his knee, as if he were simply fetching a package on a quiet morning. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and fear, the faint hum of electronics buzzing in his ears like a swarm of insects. He climbed to the 5th floor, each step a test of his resolve, the creak of the stairs echoing in the empty hallway like a warning. The walls were lined with peeling paint, the faded wallpaper a testament to the building's age, each crack a story of neglect that mirrored the treatment Marcus had faced. "James," he called, his voice steady as he reached apartment 503, the door a slab of wood that stood between him and the past he'd tried to leave behind. A raspy voice answered through the door, the sound rough and broken, like gravel underfoot. "Commander? You in the flesh? Open this door. How do I know it's not a trick?" Marcus's lips twitched, a faint smile that held no warmth, only the weight of shared history. "Raven 4, Tango Echo," he said, the code a bridge between past and present, a lifeline to a man who'd once called a mentor. A pause, then the click of locks, each one a heartbeat in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing James Carter, gray-haired, his eyes wild with desperation, his face gaunt and hollowed by years of pain. Carter saluted instinctively, his hand trembling as he raised it to his forehead, his voice cracking with a mix of awe and despair. "They said you died, Commander," he muttered, his eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting an ambush. "Not quite. Let me in," Marcus replied, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he was about to face. Inside, 4 hostages sat bound on the floor, their eyes wide with fear but unharmed, their breath shallow as they watched Marcus with a mix of hope and terror. A young woman with tear-streaked cheeks clutched a small child to her chest, her lips trembling as she whispered reassurances that sounded more like prayers. An older man, his glasses askew, stared at the floor, his hands shaking in their bindings, while a teenage boy glared at Carter with a defiance that made Marcus's heart ache with a mix of pride and fear. Marcus's gaze swept the room. 3 explosive charges on the windows, their wires glinting like veins of death, one by the back door, its red light blinking ominously, and motion sensors on every entry, their faint beeps a countdown to disaster. The air smelled of sweat and fear, the ticking of a timer faint but unmistakable, each second a reminder of the stakes. "Why, James?" Marcus asked, his voice heavy with sorrow as he sat across from Carter, his hands resting on his knees, his posture open despite the danger. Carter's laugh was bitter, broken, a sound that echoed with the pain of a man who'd lost everything. "They erased us, Commander. After Cairo, they scrubbed our records, denied us care. I faked my death, but the nightmares won't stop," he said, his voice cracking as he clutched the detonator, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of untreated trauma, a soldier betrayed by the system he'd served, left to rot in the shadows while the world moved on. Marcus's mind flashed to Cairo, the night that had broken Carter. They'd been in a safe house, the air thick with the scent of diesel and fear, when an explosion had torn through their team. Carter had been dragging a wounded soldier to safety, his face streaked with blood and ash, his eyes wide with a terror Marcus had never seen in him before. "I've got you," Carter had shouted, his voice raw as he pulled the man to cover. But it hadn't been enough. The soldier had died in his arms, and Carter had never been the same. Marcus had reported the incident, begging for support, for care, but the response had been a cold, classified, handle it. Now, seeing Carter's haunted eyes, Marcus felt a wave of guilt crash over him, the weight of that failure a stone in his chest. I saw you months ago, Marcus said, his voice soft but firm, his eyes locking onto Carter's. I knew the signs. Carter's eyes darkened, his voice a low growl as he leaned forward, his hands trembling on the detonator. And I knew you, the great Commander Freeman, reduced to a nobody they laugh at. That's what they do when we're no longer useful, he said, his words a knife that cut deep into Marcus's heart, each syllable a reminder of the system that had failed them both. Outside, the SWAT team repositioned, Daniels convincing Evans the talks had failed, his voice sharp with a desperation that made his hands shake as he gestured to the building. He's not coming out, Daniels insisted, his eyes darting to the windows as if he could see through them. We going now, Torres protested, her voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. We've got 6 minutes left, Daniels snapped, his face twisting with a mix of anger and fear. We can't risk more lives for an old man's gamble, taking charge with a recklessness that made Torres's stomach churn. The radio crackled every 30 seconds with updates, each message a nail in the coffin of Marcus's hope. Bravo team, 50 meters from entry. 40 meters. 30 meters. Each transmission tightening the knot in Marcus's chest as he sat across from Carter, the air between them thick with the weight of their shared past. The faint ticking of the timer grew louder in his ears, a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart, each second a reminder of the lives hanging in the balance. Carter held up the detonator, his hand trembling, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and defiance. They storm in, we all die. Sensors on every entrance. This place will be ash, he said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. Marcus's voice remained calm, his eyes steady as he leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees as if they were simply sharing a cup of coffee, not staring down the barrel of death. I know, he said, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm of Carter's rage. But you forgot a lesson I taught you. Carter's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of confusion. What? He asked, his voice a whisper of doubt that made Marcus's heart ache with a mix of hope and sorrow. Always check for hidden routes, Marcus said, his words a quiet command that carried the weight of their shared history. Carter's eyes widened, realization dawning too late, his hand tightening on the detonator as if he could stop the inevitable. Marcus moved with the speed of a man half his age, his movements precise, no trace of the limp he'd shown earlier, his body a testament to the training that had never left him. In 3 heartbeats, Carter was disarmed, the detonator in Marcus's hand, its cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of the moment. Outside, the SWAT team advanced, their radios blaring, abort. Abort entry. It was Torres's voice, sharp with urgency, but Daniels barked, keep moving, his voice a mix of defiance and fear as he led the team forward, his hands gripping his rifle with a desperation that made his knuckles white. Then Marcus's voice cut through the static, 5 words that stopped the team in their tracks. Shadow Wolf. Abort now. Explosives. The SWAT team froze. The code, a high-level emergency signal known only to elite operatives, its meaning a clarion call that echoed through the years. Daniels stared, bewildered, as his men halted, their rifles lowering as if pulled by an invisible force. What are you doing? Move, he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of frustration and fear. A veteran officer removed his helmet, his face pale, his voice shaky as he turned to Daniels. That code means confirmed catastrophic threat, Delta Protocol. We stop, he said, his words a quiet command that brooked no argument. At that moment, the building's main door swung open, the creak of its hinges a stark contrast to the silence that followed. Marcus emerged, guiding 4 shaken hostages, their steps unsteady but alive. Carter behind him, head bowed, wrists bound with a zip tie that Marcus had found in the apartment. Medics rushed to the hostages as Marcus handed the detonator and a notebook to Evans. The pages filled with Carter's scrawled plans, a map of destruction that could have leveled half the block. 4 weeks of planning, enough explosives to level 3 blocks. He needed help, not a bullet. Marcus said, his voice heavy with the weight of what could have been, his eyes locking onto Evans's with a quiet intensity that made the commander look away. Daniel stood rooted, his arrogance shattered, replaced by a hollow shame that made his shoulders slump, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The man he'd mocked as Old Man had just done what an entire tactical team couldn't, and the realization burned in his chest like a fire that refused to be extinguished. As the police lights painted the night in red and blue, a quiet reverence settled over the scene. The SWAT team's most seasoned members now addressed Marcus not as Sir or Freeman, but as Commander, their voices tinged with a reserve for legends. Behind those 5 words that halted an elite team lay a lifetime of unrecorded missions, a legacy of protecting a nation that had too often turned its back on him. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The system he bled for had deemed him invisible until a crisis demanded his unique expertise. By morning, Marcus Freeman's story dominated headlines. Unsung hero saves hostages, exposes decades of neglect. Photos captured the 74-year-old black man receiving a civilian honor from the mayor, his expression stoic yet proud. The police department faced a firestorm of criticism as videos of Marcus's mistreatment went viral. Old Man became a rallying cry against systemic bias. Officer Daniels was suspended, an investigation uncovering years of misconduct. A week later, Marcus received a call. "Mr. Freeman, this is the Director of National Security. We need to discuss your record." And James Carter, in a federal office, Marcus faced a panel of officers. Classified files revealed a grim truth. Carter wasn't alone. Dozens of veterans had been erased after covert ops, their care denied. Cairo never happened. Officially, the director admitted. "Neither did you." Marcus's voice was steady. "And now you want my help because it's public." The director nodded. "You train these men, so maybe planning attacks like Carter's." Marcus agreed, but on one condition: a full reintegration program for abandoned operatives with benefits and recognition. 4 months later, the Vortex Initiative launched, Marcus at its helm, overseeing the recovery of forgotten veterans. Carter was its first member, trading prison for treatment. Daniels, demoted to a desk job in a rural precinct, saw his career crumble. "How did you know Carter would pick that building?" Torres asked, now a regular at Marcus's office. Marcus smiled softly. "Observation. It's the same apartment he lived in during training 40 years ago. Patterns reveal everything if you look." Torres nodded. "The department's changing. New anti-bias training. Your story's a case study." Marcus's gaze was firm. "Protocols aren't enough. You have to change hearts." 7 months later, Marcus received an honor he never sought, a training wing named Freeman Hall, dedicated to observation and empathy in policing. A report showed a 45% drop in police violence, complaints of bias halved. "One voice can shift a system," the new chief declared. Days later, Marcus spotted Daniels in his class, now a humbled officer seeking to learn. "Observation starts when you drop your assumptions," Marcus told him, his voice a quiet challenge. Marcus's journey shows that respect isn't a rank. It's earned through actions, not appearances. How has someone's quiet strength inspired you? Share your story in the comments. We're reading every one. Reflecting in his modest apartment, Marcus hung a photo of himself receiving a civilian Medal of Honor, the 4 hostages beside him, alive because he refused to be silenced. His true victory wasn't the medal, but the motto of the Vortex Initiative: respect knows no rank. Through Daily Narrated Stories, we bring you tales like Marcus's, stories of courage and change that remind us to see beyond the surface. Don't miss your chance to be part of this movement. Subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories now. We're racing to 1,000 subscribers, and your support could make the difference today. Like, comment, and share Marcus's story to spread its message of hope and justice before it's too late.